The history of literature is like a sound in an echo chamber, growing fainter with each reiteration. Elias Canetti said about Kafka that he's the expert of power. So only if we play the game of chess, or in our case, the game of language, does it have any significance. She says that we're metaphors. We always come in the color and shape of your imagination. And so the experience of the reader is actually the limit of what you can convey. And then there were other moments where I felt like within 1 or 2 days so much clicked and I had a completely different command of the language. Hello everyone, hi. So in this video we're gonna talk about why Kafka didn't want to be famous, how time can be conceptualized in literature, the philosophy of language, and many other things that I have learned during my first year of studying literature. If this is the first video of mine that you're watching, then hello, welcome. My name is Maria, and I have just finished my first year of my degree of comparative literature at the University of Vienna. And I'm making this video truly for my past self, because when I looked into studying literature a little bit later in life, right, I'm almost 30, I really wanted to know what it looks like tangibly to do a degree at university. So yesterday I went through both of these folders. The bottom one is from the first semester and the top one from the second one. And obviously this video is not gonna give you a complete picture of everything that I've learned, but when I went through the folders, I really asked myself what the things are that struck a chord in me, the information that I'm really grateful that someone has explained to me, and the things that I'm really taking with me going forward in my life. So may this video reach through the portal of time to convince my past self to hopefully make the same decisions over and over again. Because let me tell you, I love studying literature. The fact that my love for words and language can be at the center of my life makes me incredibly grateful. And I can say with confidence that I haven't regretted my decision once. So this year I took 12 courses total. An introductory course to literature, an introductory course to comparative literature, a course on time and memory in modern literature, a course that was called The Provocative Spirit of Literature, the classics and their controversies, the colonial past and post-colonial present reflected in literature of the Low Countries, literary research, another literary research course, thematology, world literature, a seminar on the spectrum of postmodern writing, the social history of the novel, and Norwegian, a language course. So I'm gonna pull from those courses in no specific order. Before we get into it, I have a new microphone that I can try out today. I'm really happy I can gesture a little bit more. And on that note, I'm also gonna say if you want to support the channel financially, I'm gonna leave the link to my Ko-fi account down below. I really appreciate your support, and it makes it possible for me to keep these videos going and to upgrade my equipment. So, grab a cup of tea, let's get into it. So the first thing I learned about the philosophy of language really still sticks with me. More precisely, we talked about structuralism and post-structuralism, which is a philosophy that came up in the past, let's say 100 to 150 years. So let me explain. Structuralists and post-structuralists basically say that language is a net in which we're caught, and a net that our entire sense of reality relies on. This net, though, isn't grounded in any objective truth. And you can see that if you observe language long enough. You know, the words keep changing. There's actually a quote by Ferdinand de Saussure, who wrote in his course in general linguistics that time changes all things, there is no reason why language should escape this universal law. You might also notice this if you speak several languages and you realize that in some languages there isn't even a word for something that another language does have a word for. I think there's this example that in the Swedish language there's like 7 different words for rain, and then in some languages from places where it barely ever rains, they just have 1 or 2 words, which I think points to the fact that the way you conceptualize reality, the way you engage with reality, really depends on the words that you have available. And it's very difficult for something to exist in your mind if you don't have a word for it. Another aspect of this that structuralists and post-structuralists will point to is that, for example, this microphone and the word microphone really have nothing to do with each other. They're not actually connected. It's a completely arbitrary combination of sounds that makes a word that we then attribute to this thing. But this isn't a contract that is written down anywhere, right? It's not law, and language doesn't equal nature. And all that is, of course, very scary to admit, especially for endeavors like science, where people want to be very precise and truthful. So language, and therefore, of course, literature, are very nebulous and uncertain in that way, but also free. So Saussure says that language and words are like chess horses, right? That's why I always have those here on my desk. He argues that outside the game of chess, this means nothing. This little wooden thing has no worth or meaning at all unless we engage in the game of chess and give it that meaning. So only if we play the game of chess, or in our case, the game of language, does it have any significance. The second thing I really enjoyed learning about was how to talk about books that I haven't read. And I remember one of my professors bringing that up in one of the first lessons I ever had at uni. And he basically said that, look, you're literature students now, you're gonna get into this situation very often where you're forced to talk about books that you haven't actually read. We based this entire discussion on a book by Pierre Bernhards. I wanted to say Pierre Menard. It's originally French, Comment parler des livres qu'on n'a pas lus, I think. How to talk about books you haven't read. And in this book, Pierre Bernhards also talks about the fact that the line between reading and not reading is really very thin. You know, what about a book you've read 20 years ago? Is it still a book that you've read, even if you can recall none of it? What about a book you have half read? What about a book you have skimmed? And he says that even in not reading, you can actively participate in the literary discourse. And he takes this example of Robert Musil's The Man Without, where our protagonist goes to a library and he looks around all the books there, and he calculates that if he read a book every day, it would take him 10,000 years to finish all the books in the library. And of course, as lovers of literature, we feel the same way, right? There's so many books and we just know we're never going to get through them all. And it feels like an uphill battle that can never be won. And then the protagonist in Musil's novel gets really stressed out, and he asks the librarian, how do you deal with this mass of books? And the librarian says, well, it's really easy. I just don't read. And then he's like, what do you mean you don't read? And then he says, let me show you. And they go to the back room of the library where all the catalogs are, where every book that is in the library is recorded, how it is connected to the other books and where to find it. So the librarian, instead of close reading, takes an approach of distant reading, cares about creating a net between all the works, thereby being able to see connection and to engage in discourse in a very different way. And Pierre Bernhards says that this is an active approach to not reading. And all that to say is that, we really have to find a way to get rid of our shame of not reading and to just rely on the information that we do have. Because if you talk about literature a lot, it's not going to take a very long time until you come across a conversation or something where you're forced to either talk about a book that you haven't actually read, or you feel too shy or inferior, and so you just don't engage in the discussion at all. So that was a really lovely lecture to have in the beginning of my studies. I mean, our professor didn't say that we shouldn't read, of course. He just said that there is a skilled approach to those moments when you do come across this situation. And it really helped me, even with the feeling of studying literature, knowing that there's so much I haven't read, and constantly feeling like someone's gonna expose me at any moment for not having read a particular work of literature. The next thing I want to talk about has to do with translation. And I've learned many fascinating things about translation. In fact, I've made an entire video about it. I can link it up here in the cards. But there was a very special moment when we looked at A Sentimental Journey through France and Italy and France. And we talked about how difficult it is to translate the nuances of his writing. There are so many double meanings and irony in his words that make it a huge task, if not impossible, to translate to another language. And I want to read you a little part of A Sentimental Journey, just because it's absolutely beautiful. I almost fell off the chair when I read this for the first time. So enjoy. But also, if you do speak another language other than English, ask yourself how in the world this could be translated. The passage is about, I think, celibacy and holding back of being engaged in the world of love, right? He asks himself whether he should pull himself out completely out of any sexual desires or desires for love and companionship. And he says, "Yes, and then ye whose clay-cold heads and lukewarm hearts can argue down or mask your passions, tell me, what trespass is it that man should have them? Or how his spirit stands answerable to the Father of spirits, but for his conduct under them? If nature has so wove her web of kindness, that some threads of love and desire are entangled in the piece, must the whole web be rent in drawing them out? Whip me such stoics, great governor of nature, said I to myself, wherever thy providence shall place me for the trials of my virtue, whatever is my danger, whatever is my situation, let me feel the movements which rise out of it, and which belong to me as a man, and if I govern them as a good one, I will trust the issue to thy justice, for thou hast made us, and not we ourselves." What I've also really enjoyed learning about is Flaubert's view on literature. He says that literature basically expresses that which is unheard of, unconscious, or what is suppressed from public discord. So literature writes from the outside in, and he also says that a real piece of art should always kick off some kind of inner crisis. And I'm just really fascinated with Flaubert's precision of the art of writing, his incredible attention to finding the right word. He really heightened the status of the novel by doing that. So when the novel first emerged as a genre, it was really brushed off as being mere entertainment. It wasn't high art or high literature by any means. And he really changed that. He also used some quite revolutionary techniques that are used in film now, way before film even existed. It's called, I think, parallel editing, where two scenes happen at the same time, and the cutting constantly goes back and forth between the two. That's why Madame Bovary reads like a movie. Yeah, I just really enjoyed having some background insights, so that when I actually read Madame Bovary, I knew what to look out for. That's actually another thing that I've learned, is how valuable it is to just have some information about a book before going into it. I find it so daunting often to read books that have a reputation of being very difficult. It's hard to open it when I know nothing about it. And so often, even just the fact that a professor of mine mentioned it, said a couple of sentences about it, has really lowered the hurdle for me to go out and buy the book and read the book. Yeah, I remember a situation when a professor of mine said that Ulysses isn't actually that difficult. It's just a very long book. You just really have to take the time to read it. But it's not anything that can't be done. And I think only just hearing that really helped me. I don't know. I think what I'm trying to say is that I recognize the value of getting some information up front and not having to go into something blind or without any help. And that's the real value of studying literature, is for me that I have people that do that and make it easier for me to engage with texts, and I hope that I can somehow give that to you through these videos as well. Next point I wrote down is that I learned how to argue, or how to craft a solid argument. Because let me tell you, I love to vaguely philosophize and let my intuition work on things and then just spit something back out. But you know, if you have to work scientifically at university, that doesn't work so well. And I remember one instance where I had to write a scientific paper about a topic of my choice. And I chose Emily Dickinson's ambivalent relationship to death, because I thought she had an ambivalent relationship to death. I love her poetry, and when I read her poems, I feel like she talks about death with comfort and then with terror at the same time. But now the question is, how do you actually prove that? Or how do you at least structure your thoughts in a way that this is not just something you throw on the table, but something that actually has some backing up, you know? And that's really difficult for me. And I still struggle with this whole scientific approach. But my professor really pushed me to sort of go down this road of researching her more. I looked at 3 of her poems. There's a certain slant of light, I died for beauty, and because I could not stop for death. And then I took some letters in that she wrote to friends of hers or acquaintances at the same time. I read some articles, and I came to a much more profound understanding of her approach. And I know this all sounds really basic, like of course you would do that, and what's the big deal about it? But I think I have a little bit of a, I don't know, it's not my first instinct to do that. And I think I've learned to just be a little bit less afraid of it. Because I think what I was afraid of is that it would just, you know, this approach of being so scientific would somehow destroy the insight I originally had, or the intuition or something. And I'm learning that maybe it's a false dichotomy. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm actually going to read you just a little quote that I have found in my research about Emily Dickinson, a letter she wrote where she talks about death, and then we can round off this point. I wish it was plainer, lo, the anguish in this world. I wish one could be sure that the suffering had a loving side. The thought to look down someday and see the crooked steps we came from a safer place must be a precious thing. Next, I was really fascinated to learn the many ways in which time can be conceptualized in literature. So this has been my favorite course all year. It was called Time and Memory in Modern Literature, and this course might be the reason why I started studying. Like, I remember reading this online, and I thought about a year ago, and I thought, okay, when October rolls around, I cannot not sit in this course. So with my professor, we looked at different novels by William Faulkner, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, Thomas Mann, Hugo von Hofmannsthal, Proust, and we looked at what they did with time, right? How they expressed time through metaphors like water, arrows, spirals, stairs, through symbols like the sun or libraries, through symbolic numbers or dates, how they made the reader feel time through slowing down or speeding up the narrative, how they create the effect of memory reappearing, right, in Proust's famous mandolin scene. We also looked at the difference between clock time and mind time, and we put a special emphasis on the works of Virginia Woolf because she was truly the most creative when it comes to this in her writing, basically trying all she could to conceptualize time in different ways in her novels. From Mrs. Dalloway to The Years to The Lighthouse, Orlando, and so on. We actually looked at a little passage in Orlando where she makes time pass in the simplest way possible. Yeah, in chapter 6 of Orlando, she says, "It was now November. After November comes December, then January, February, March, and April. After April comes May, June, July, August follows. Next is September, then October. And so, behold, here we're back at November again, with the whole year accomplished." Something I learned that is a little bit more personal to me, because it's something very important in my opinion and something I was a little bit afraid of when I started studying literature, was how to be in a system without accepting it completely. And by that I mean the university system. I'm proud to say that I think I've found a way on how to engage with this whole academic system and take from it what I need and what I can get and what feeds my curiosity, while at the same time staying critical and not accepting everything. I get a lot of comments under my videos of people being worried that the university system might change me, or that, university makes people think this way, or I don't know. And I understand those concerns because I had them too. But I think it's a trap to not go after something you love because of that. And here it really comes in handy that I'm a little bit older, because I just don't accept everything that comes my way, and finding the balance and not being indoctrinated on the one hand, but also not being so overly critical that I do not accept anything that comes my way. So that is just like a personal little win, or something that I'm just happy that I've managed this year. What I've also learned is that Plato apparently had a big problem with literature. So in his ideal state, Plato would have banned all poets, because he says that literature is in direct conflict with philosophy, simply because literature doesn't tell the truth, and philosophy is all about writing the truth. And the only way that he would allow literature in his ideal state is if it would show people and characters in the best way possible. So literature should show people how they ideally would be, not how they actually are. Literature needs to be a good example for people. And we also looked about Aristotle's answer to that, and Aristotle thought that there's a lot of worth in literature, that, you know, even if they are fictional stories, they have a sort of cathartic effect, and that it is actually a wonderful tool for learning and instilling virtues. You can read all about that in Aristotle's Poetics, a very fundamental work for literature, I would say. And I think what fascinated me about that is that this was so many thousands of years ago. And I feel like this battle between truth and fiction, literature and philosophy, it's still going on in a way. And it's not only going on in between people. I feel like it's also going on inside of me sometimes. So, you know, I always love something that is so old yet so relevant. Next thing I learned was just how messy it is to learn a language. I think I've forgotten that because it's been a while since I've really learned a language from scratch. But learning Norwegian from zero this semester has really been just such a linear experience. Like, there were moments where I felt like I've really made no progress at all for 3 weeks at a time. And then there were other moments where I felt like within 1 or 2 days so much clicked and I had a completely different command of the language. And I tried to surround myself with the language as much as I could. And at some point I was just like, I have no idea what I'm doing, but let me just listen to this podcast. Let me just read this and let me hope, you know, let me hope it all comes together and it eventually clicks. And I'm a very not messy person, I would say, especially not in my studying. You know, I like to plan things and have an overview and all of that. And with language learning, it kind of all flies out the window. I think I've also realized how easy and difficult it is at the same time to learn a language that is very similar to one that you're already speaking. So, you know, I thought Norwegian is gonna be very easy for me because I speak German and English and Dutch, and Norwegian has so many commonalities with those languages. And that's true. You know, it definitely made it easier for me to understand the language when I hear it, to learn vocabulary and grammar. But it also made it a lot harder in the sense that I had to be careful to not just speak Dutch. And in fact, in my Norwegian course, there were some people who were learning Swedish or Icelandic at the same time, and they have mixed up their languages the entire time. So it's just hard to keep them apart when the languages, you know, are very similar. And I didn't expect that. Like, this was the first time I actually really felt this. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about was an interesting discussion we had around the topic of myths. And we looked specifically at a play by Femi Osofisan, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, that is called Tigoni, the African Antigone. So she did a rewriting of Sophocles' myth of Antigone. And the rewritten play talks a lot about colonialism in Nigeria and takes a look at the present and how unstable the country is because of colonialism. And in the play, the actual real Antigone also suddenly comes and speaks. So it's a little bit of a metalepse, it's called. So the character from the original play suddenly appears in this rewritten play. She says that we're metaphors, we always come in the color and shape of your imagination, implying that there is not one Antigone, and that, depending on where you are in the world and the culture you grow up with, the Antigone myth can and will resonate with you, but Antigone might look very different in your head. And so these characters are malleable. And I just found that such a beautiful image of those eternal truths that aren't static, because people make out of them what they need in the moment. Which, yeah, I'm just thankful for this image that I'm taking with me on that. I think everyone could benefit a lot from kind of just zooming out and seeing literary characters that way. That's all I'm gonna say about that. Another lovely point a professor of mine mentioned, really just quickly in class, but it stuck with me, was on the limits of language and literature. So he gave us this example. If you write, for example, person A gives person B a bouquet of freesias, that's a specific kind of flower, then the reader might or might not know what these flowers look like and smell like. And your experience of reading will be very different depending on your knowledge of what these flowers look and smell like, right? You either have a very complete picture or you have a picture that is kind of grayish. And so the experience of the reader is actually the limit of what you can convey, right? It's turning around that notion that the writer has to give the reader everything. No, the reader brings to a work of literature all of his or her experience, and the writer can only do so much. The reader might, depending on their abilities, make a lot less out of what you're writing, or actually a lot more. Maybe they know things you don't even know. Next point was about novels and how the origins of the novel around 1500 to 1600 really allowed people to deal with the intense opening of life circumstances that was going on back then. So, 400 or 500 years ago, people suddenly had a lot more freedom than they were used to. Religion was taken down from the pedestal, but these circumstances also made people afraid in a way and lost. The Marxist philosopher and literary critic Georgi Lukács, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, called this transzendentale Obdachlosigkeit, or in English, transcendental homelessness. And he wrote a book, The Theory of the Novel, in which he argues that writing, and especially novel writing, is always closely mirroring what is going on in society, so our collective development, and that the novel stands for the effort of the free individual to find oneself. Because individualism was the fertile soil for the novel, this free form to emerge. Mostly because people are not comfortable with this complete openness of things, the dissolvement of rules and the loss of metaphysical meaning. And novels or writing are a way to reconcile that. Oh, as the next point I have written down, something I've kind of already touched on, but how much I can love a book when I just know a little bit about it and when someone else talks about it passionately. I've had that experience with The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, which is, a big book, a little bit of an intimidating book, and I don't think I would have been able to pick it up and actually read it all the way through this year if it wasn't for my professor who talked about it a bit. And don't get me wrong, it was still hard to read, but even just some hints about the book that I don't have to go in blind was really perfect. And there was another book I had to read for my seminar on postmodern writing, I Hate Fiction by Tim Shaner. And something that is in the same vein, different, but in the same vein as, learning to love books, was my experience of reading that novel, because I really hated it in the beginning. I really couldn't stand it. I knew I had to make a presentation about it, I have to write a work about it, and I just despised the book. However, when I then started talking to my colleague who I had to do the presentation with, we sort of started to appreciate it. We also contacted the author, and he explained to us his process of writing and what he has thought about when writing the novel. And just all these things slowly coming together, understanding what this person actually meant when they were writing it, now makes me look at the book in a different way. I don't know, I've just had many experiences where my initial hesitation or critique of a book was just mellowed by something that had to do with uni, and I'm really grateful for that. Then I learned some interesting things about Paris, and that Paris actually used to be the literary center of Europe, if not the world. And anything that had to do with literature sort of went through Paris. And that not too long ago, anyone who, had anything to do with literature was able to speak French, which is very illuminating because French is still such a large literary language, and I never quite understood why. Many books that actually weren't allowed to be published somewhere else were first published in Paris, like Nabokov's Lolita or James Joyce's Ulysses. The next point I want to talk about could truly be its own video, and I've thought about making a separate video about it. But it is that I learned to make peace with postmodern literature. So if you don't know, postmodernism basically describes the time of the past 100 years or so and the literary style that is very dominant in that time that we're living in. And I never liked literature from the past 100 years or something. I mean, it's not that I don't like it, I just don't gravitate towards it. Maybe it's because I love modernism, I love the subjectivity of what came before postmodernism, so I'm just sad that, Proust and Virginia Woolf are over, and that now I feel like everyone's just one-upping each other with breaking the rules of writing and being deliberately unaesthetic and fragmented and critiquing society in this kind of snarky, ironic way, never really coming to any kind of conclusion, and the sense of lost meaning, that's all hallmarks of postmodern literature. Thomas Bernhards said that our greatest pleasure surely is in fragments, just as we derive the most pleasure from life if we regard it as a fragment, whereas the whole and the complete and the perfect are basically abhorrent. So something happened in the course of this seminar that I took where I just learned to understand the philosophy behind postmodern literature more. And I made peace with it in the fact that I understand that this is the anxiety that we're currently living in, and that the reason why I'm so uncomfortable with it is because it's very relevant to me as well. I just don't want to be confronted with it. I don't want literature to make me even more uneasy about the time we're living in. Does that make any sense? So I think what I'm trying to say is I realize there are things inside of me that I don't want to look at, and postmodern literature is just continuously pushing that button. So I can appreciate it doing that. That doesn't mean that I'm a big fan of postmodern literature now. It just means that I understand. I read you a quote by Pessoa before we go on about postmodern literature. The history of literature is like a sound in an echo chamber, growing fainter with each reiteration. Okay, now I want to talk about Kafka and why he never wanted to be big or famous. Kafka actually wrote a lot of novels and stories that he never published. It was always recommended to him that he should, write a novel to get some success, but he stayed away from all that fame and actually wanted his work to be destroyed after his death. And the reason why he did it was because he wanted to stay away from power. He always really critiqued power in his novels. Like his American novel is really a big critique of capitalism and power hierarchies. He constantly asks himself what a just society is and makes us question the notion that everyone gets what they deserve. Actually, Elias Canetti said about Kafka that he's the expert of power. And Kafka, wanting to stay small, makes himself small in his life as well. And he also writes like that. His stories are always about small animals, like bugs. And in his real life, Kafka would hang out on playgrounds on Sundays where poor families would be and their children would play. And he was never interested in any kind of wealth or fame. And his last story, The Hunger Artist, is about a man who strips himself of power as well, right? It's about a man who just stops eating. And he strips himself of power in two ways. First of all, he makes himself so weak by not eating that he himself cannot do. He cannot, he cannot exert power over others. But also, because he's so weak, the really powerful are not interested in him and leave him alone. I just find it interesting to think about what Kafka would think about his fame now. The fact that his work was not destroyed, but that he is in fact one of the most loved and studied writers of all time. Which leads me to the next point. Wow, I'm really feeling that my voice is getting hoarse. This must be the longest video I've ever made. Still have a couple of pages to go. Okay, just some last points I wanted to touch on. I think one thing I learned that I didn't realize was the extent of Thomas Bernhards' influence. I mean, obviously, Thomas Bernhard was Austrian and I know him. I just didn't expect him to have such a global influence. In fact, even on my videos, I often have people from South America, for example, comment that they love Thomas Bernhard and that he's huge over there. And I'm like, really? That's weird. I think I'm slowly catching on to the virus. I find him kind of annoying, but I also kind of get it. So yeah, apparently so many people were influenced by his writing style, and people really seem to get sucked into his writing and cannot put it down. Adam Eric Sachs says that Bernhard's imitability is infamous, and it's because a truism for all of us writing in his shadow that we have to shield ourselves against his influence. Close the books or walk away. But I find that I can't really close the books and don't want to. And I don't want to, sorry. Okay, last point before my voice gives up. We looked at the myth of debutats, I don't know, which is an ancient Greek myth about a young woman who traced the contour of her lover's face on the wall with a pencil. And the myth says that, this man, her lover, is leaving for a trip and she wants to preserve some of his memory and therefore draws the line of his face so that when he's gone, she still has something that she can look at. And that this might as well be the beginning of writing, and that this is such a critical moment because what this young woman does is she basically takes herself out of the present, out of being with her lover, and projects into the future. So she has a notion of time, right? And that writing could only, or symbols and drawing, writing, whatever, could only start to exist when people have a sense of time. So they can anticipate what will happen in the future and they can act accordingly. And the question is whether that is a good thing or not, because this act of desire can also be a very problematic one, right? The Buddha said that the end of desire is the end of sorrow. And Derrida actually called it the breaking of immediacy, right? So this sort of progress that we can write and project into the future and the past comes from a sense of discontent, and that art comes out of limitation, or at least that is, some things that were thrown on the table in this discussion. And I'm not entirely sure yet what I think about it, but I thought that was fascinating to think about. Jesus Christ. Okay, wow. I really have to end the video now. It's gonna be 2 hours of footage at least. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave me a comment, send me an email if you want to. I always leave everything in the description down below. If you've benefited from listening to this, please consider supporting the channel financially. I appreciate you so much for doing that. And other than that, I'll see you again in the next video. Bye bye.